Instead, what we do is we take that same expertise and say, go write prompts, right? Take the process you would have used to think about how you would analyze an article or a news event or stories about it, and go play with prompts and go write them. Because one of the truly spectacular changes of being in this world of large language models and generative AI is that you can take the expertise of non programmers and apply it and surface it. And in fact, what you often find is that non-programmers sometimes write much better prompts because they're not thinking like a programmer. They're just thinking like, well, how would I tell a human about this?
Welcome to Anchor Change, where we help you panic responsibly in a chaotic world. I'm Katie Harbath. I've navigated impossible trade-offs in tech, politics, and my personal life for decades. I know that can be lonely. As a Midwesterner who spent 20 years in Silicon Valley and DC, it's taken me a while to figure it out. I still am. One thing that helps me is hearing the stories of other people forging their own paths. Because in a world of complexity, you don't have to navigate it alone. Welcome to Anchor Change. Hey, welcome to Anchor Change. I'm your host, Katie Harbath. It is season 5, and I am really excited about some of the guests that I have coming to you all this season. We're going to be talking about Gen Z, we're going to be talking about AI, and of course, we're going to be talking about politics. First up, I have Cory Ondrejka up. I've recently met Cory, and we actually have a lot in common. We have Madison and Wisconsin in common. We were both early Facebookers. He was earlier than I am, but now he's doing some really interesting work at the intersection of AI and news. And so we are talking about how he thinks about the balance between humans and AI, using AI to help people to get reliable news, to understand when they need to look at different sources. And so we have some really interesting conversations about how he's trying to use AI to build responsibly. And so I hope you enjoy. Cory, welcome to Anchor Change.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm really excited to chat with you, especially when we first met. We discovered that we have a lot in common with our background, not only with places that we worked, but also Madison, Wisconsin. And I kind of want to start there in sort of your early days. What brought you to Madison? What was that like? I think you were there in sort of the mid 90s, if I remember correctly.
Late is actually.
Okay.
So I grew up in a mix of outside of Boston and Milwaukee. And if you grow up in Milwaukee, a lot of your friends end up going to Madison. And my parents had both gone to Madison as well. And so it was a constant place to visit. And then once, friends who were a little bit older were going to college, then it was an even more interesting place to go visit. And so it was, Madison in 87, 88, 89, kind of that period before I went to the East Coast of the Naval Academy. Madison has always been this extraordinary place because you hear about it, especially if you have family that went there, in the middle of the Midwest, in the middle of, a state that has sort of moved in different directions politically over the years. Madison has always been this very, very unique place, not only the state capital, dominated by UW, and a pretty wonderful place to spend time.
Yeah, any of us who've gone there, we don't shut up about it. And I just came back from a trip there where I was like, this is fantastic. It was the perfect Madison weather too. It was like crisp fall weather. You were sitting on the terrace. We were having a beer. It was fantastic. And I'm curious, what did that experience of, especially growing up between both the East Coast and Milwaukee, kind of Midwest, how did that shape sort of your thoughts of like technology, creativity, community? Like when you look back on that, did it have an impact, you think, on your career and your life?
Well, I think it's hard to brush against Madison and not have some aspect of creativity get, increased by that. It was funny. I was reading the book that you recommended, The History of the Onion, and I hadn't realized that I've been reading The Onion since it came out. And because I had friends there when they launched. And then when I went to college, they were sending me copies of these very early, just insane slips of paper, basically, that were The Onion. And it was something that, one, like you never have laughed as much as sitting around at the Naval Academy, a very serious place most of the time, with a group of friends reading The Onion, this insane countercultural combination of mostly, advertising at the time for local Madison things, but this just absurdist sense of humor. So I think that was very much one thing. The other aspect is late 80s was this period of still the Cold War, computers were becoming a very common item, or at least they were starting to be. And if you were somebody who brushed up against or started using computers in that time period and start programming, and suddenly it was like, oh, wow, you could make computers do really interesting things. And for me, it was teach them how to, make games, because why wouldn't you build games for a living? And you know, there was both in Milwaukee, there was a lot of really active user communities around early computers, particularly the Ataris in that era. And then, of course, Madison as always a very first-rate school and university, you had tons of computer use and access to computer labs and programs you could take. Like, I was doing classes at UW-Milwaukee on CAD, computer-aided design in like 1987. And it was just mind-blowing what was possible. And it really was eye-opening for what was coming. And I think set me on a path to always be really fascinated by technology and really want to be engaging with technology as much as possible to build really cool things.
Do you have a favorite memory at all from those times that sticks with you still today?
Well, I mean, you can't be in Madison and not visit the Red Shed. So,
Yeah?
that is, though the memories end up getting hazy very quickly at the Red Shed. So,
I'm trying to remember if I saw them there when I was there last week or not. You'd be amazed. I don't know when the last time you've been there, but how much has changed, but how much stays the same. Go ahead. It's remarkable of kind of I'd just been there in June and I was like, that apartment building wasn't there. This store wasn't there. But then there was still State Street Brats. There was still the terrace. There was still all those other things. And a lot of us were commenting about how it's different, but still feels familiar at the same time.
well, and totally. And like, there is nothing, it's the same thing you jumped on, right? There's just nothing like sitting out at the terrace with a beer on the right kind of day, not a hot and humid day, not a day where, the mosquitoes are out, but the dragonflies haven't hatched yet. Those days get a little bit, less awesome to be sitting around outside, but there are the perfect days. But I think, for me, college was always going to be a go somewhere else kind of adventure. And in some ways, it's the bummer about growing up in Wisconsin, where Madison's sort of your local school. Part of being a teenager and a young adult is at least pondering, are you going to go somewhere else? Are you going to go learn something different? And so in some ways, it kind of takes Madison off your radar, or it falls into a sort of like, well, it'll be the backup, or it'll be the fallback school, even though it's, again, everybody who's been there is like, this was the coolest place to go to school ever. And why doesn't everybody just go here? But for me, it was pretty clear I was going to go somewhere away.
It's funny. It's really for me, my dad was like, it's in-state tuition. You're going to Madison. And it was actually very different from Green Bay. If I have to tell
Yeah.
you that, it was the first time I really encountered a lot of different diversity than you don't get in the Green Bay area, even just being 2.5 hours away. But Madison's really that school also for East Coast people to go away from, so
Right.
if they're from New England or something like that, they're wanting to go to the Midwest, whereas Midwesterners might be trying to get out. But how did you end up at the Naval Academy then?
Well, it was a similar thing. I was either going to go to in-state tuition, or I needed to go to some place that had a full ride, because those were going to be the options. And so at the service academies are, service in exchange for the education. And also growing up in the middle of the Cold War, very much for me, it was, is there a way to give back? Felt very lucky to have the opportunities that I had growing up in the United States, and growing up with, things like computers coming online, and just incredible capabilities at the touch of our fingers. And so the notion of what are the ways to pay some of that back, and service for me, like, I didn't come from a military family or anything like that, but it was very much on my mind as this seems like a really strong path, and had the side benefit of could afford to go there.
So then you started your tech career, I don't know if it started at Second Life or not, but early on you were Second Life, which for people who might not remember, these were early online communities. I remember when I can't remember which senator was one of the first politicians to use Second Life because when you were at Second Life, I was early on in politics. And I remember distinctly like having to try to explain to politicians that, yeah, I know people are flying around in this space, but like this is kind of the future of online communities in some ways and gaming and all of that. But you've been at Facebook, you've been at Google, and I want to certainly talk about NewsArc and SmartNews that you're at now. But like, your career seems to be very much about building online spaces. And what sort of values or lessons have remained constant in you in building those and kind of doing that throughout your career?
Well, I'd say that it's always been more interesting to build products for people. Like I think there are folks who like technology just for the act of creating technology or just for the, like pure researchers in academia, right? You may have to changing the world, but you're chasing some, interesting problem or some interesting puzzle. And from the beginning of first building games in computers with computers, it was always who's going to play this and what's their experience going to be like and how are they going to react to it, and starting in arcade where you're testing it by watching somebody put a quarter in and then do they come back and put a second quarter in? Do they keep playing it? Did they enjoy it? What did they bring to it? And that kind of product development is it's live without a net because no matter how much you care about what you built and no matter how much you put your body and soul into it and the team's body and soul into it, they might still not like it, and so no product really ever survives first contact with customers. And so you need this combination of sort of wild hubris to believe you might be able to build something that people would want to engage with or use or that matters to them, but also complete humility because while end users can't tell you how to fix your product, they can tell you they don't like it.
Yeah.
And so you do that once, and it was like, "Oh, no, this is what I wanna keep doing." And that path starting from games and then taking that to Second Life, which was this intersection of very game-like technology and experiences, but also just so much more because it was this foundation and platform for people to kinda do whatever they wanted with it. And that expansion of the possible, right, where it was okay, we're not just building a game for a few people to buy in a store or even just to download. This is something that people are really going to be able to create amazing things in, that they're going to be able to expand their possibilities by using. Was again, how could you not want to keep doing that once you've had a chance to do that? And I think I've been really fortunate where as technologies kept moving forward and as new technologies have emerged, I've been able to be at companies with interesting challenges and interesting opportunities to try to create something interesting, amidst all of that change.
I'm curious when you were at Second Life, like, I have to imagine politicians using it was very weird for you all. Like, were there other use cases that popped up that you just had no idea was just not on your realm of possibility, but that ended up happening?
I mean, we could do multiple hours of things that are surprising just because you're never going to stay ahead of what millions of people are capable of doing. And whether it was stroke survivors building experiences inside Second Life to help with their own cognitive recovery, right? Because it turns out if
Mm,
you survive a stroke, one of the predictors of your long-term recovery is social engagement. And that can often be really hard if you're mobility impaired after a stroke, which is really common. And a stroke survivor was using Second Life and realized they could keep using it. And suddenly they could build an entire social network and engage with people and have really rich and complex interactions. But rather than just doing that for themselves, they realized, wait, I can go build this for somebody else. And things you just couldn't imagine that. Yeah, there were politicians, there were rock concerts, and it's everything that we then see in Roblox and Fortnite
mhm.
and some of the later products that have come along into that space. And a lot of it is you sort of watch the rediscovery of wait, we could go do this. But it was very much questions from the beginning of how much capability do you give to people? What limits, if any, do you put on them? And I think for me, it was some of the first brushes with what happens with attention reinforcement and what happens when you're trying to create policies in very complex, very open environments, particularly across national boundaries. I don't think any of us had any idea that what we were wrestling with at Linden, building Second Life, would be the next 20 years of Facebook and Google and everyone try to navigate these very, very complex questions. And nor at that point were we looking far enough ahead to see where attention reinforcement in feeds and how that would impact content delivery in general and news delivery in particular. But it was those first brushes. And so as I've ended up interacting and building in those spaces more in the 20 years since, a lot of it's ended up being very, at times familiar, reminiscent, but also, yeah, we saw some inklings of this. What did we do differently back then? What could we do differently now?
Well, and I think that's really, I was just thinking about the fact with OpenAI launching their Sora app and Meta launching their Vibes app. And this question that I've been reading about of like, wait, OpenAI is just letting people create these videos. Where are the guardrails? What does that look like? And to your point, there's that kind of grappling with it, but then also of you can't possibly think of every permeation at scale that
Mhm.
everyone's going to think about to create those guardrails. And I want to get into the AI stuff a little bit more, but before we do that, I do want to touch on particularly Facebook, given that we have that shared history there,
Yeah.
because you were very early on in the platform. I started in 2011. I would argue this was when everyone still thought that social media was going to be the bee's knees. That we all thought we had a lot of hope for what it was going to be, and I still think there's been a lot of good that's come out of it, but we didn't spend enough time in the beginning days thinking about how do you mitigate the bad. And I've been thinking about this question a lot because a lot of times I get asked, do you feel guilty for stuff that you did? And I have wrestled with that a lot. And I've found, and I think for myself, there's a difference between guilt and feeling responsibility and feeling and trying to grapple with that you were doing the best you could with what information you had in the time, and history is driven out in a different way than maybe what your intentions were around all of that. And so that's my very long way preamble of sort of asking you yourself, when you look back on those Facebook days, what are some of the lessons that you're taking from that you are using today in thinking about what you're building now?
Well, it's such a good question. And, you think back to that period 15, 16 years ago, and it's easy to kind of forget that we went from, you know, metered long distance to free worldwide video conferencing in like just a snap of our fingers. The big tech companies were the ones advancing this. The notion of let's give everyone on the planet superpowers, like that did happen. And there are a bunch of positives that came with that. The pieces that, frankly, I think we underestimated and have been wrestling with ever since is as we were moving on to mobile, and as in early 2012, we were wrestling with how are we going to make mobile profitable? Because at the time, and it's easy to forget, like we were restating our S1. We were getting knocked because everybody was like, well, Facebook's just going to fall over because nobody can monetize mobile. And so we were asking really hard questions about what can we do in a mobile feed. We obviously already had mobile feeds, but we didn't have mobile feeds that were reliable and performant, and we didn't have mobile feeds that had personalized advertising in them. Because at the time, all the personal ads were in
The
the
sidebar.
sidebars on Facebook, and the only things in newsfeed were social ads. And it turned out that even at Facebook scale, the number of truly social ads is basically zero. And so the change in February was, nope, we're going to actually start bringing in non-social ads, but instead personalized ads.
But can you
And
really quickly, as one interrupts,
yeah,
can
yeah,
you just explain the difference between a social
sure.
ad and
So
a personalized ad?
a social ad is your friend went to Taco Bell and Taco Bell wants to advertise. And so you get a socially relevant ad. And that's the limit. And so don't get any ad that's missing the proof point of your friend did something. And so that was a hypothesis around social ads. It's just the volume of social ads is very, very. low, again, even at Facebook scale. And then a personalized ad is something where you use some model of who the person is, whether they're explicitly telling you, whether you're inferring things, whether you're using machine language modeling of they look like somebody else to say, I think this ad would be relevant to you, even though it's not that your friend did something, but it is, well, I'm a middle-aged white dude in California. This might be a relevant ad to me. And those hadn't been in Facebook's news feed prior to early 2012. And that's when we started experimenting. And as it turns out, these worked really, really well. They worked incredibly well on mobile. They worked so well on mobile that once we had mobile products that actually were good, mobiles, immediately surpassed desktop for Facebook because, well, it turns out normal people actually would rather use Facebook on a phone than, carry a laptop into a social event. I mean, I'm sure my friends would carry a laptop into a social event, but like the average person would rather have their phone. And so that was a tremendous change. Now at the time, and part of the reason why we really didn't immediately notice the challenging and problematic aspects of what's called attention reinforcement, because ultimately the machine language models underneath all this are doing something called attention reinforcement, right? They are saying, hey, you engaged with this piece of content, an ad or a story or whatever. You liked it, you shared it, you commented on it. That's engagement. Let's give you more things like that. And in Facebook of 2011, 2012, most of newsfeed was what your friends were doing, which meant that attention reinforcement actually meant you got more stuff from your friends, which was kind of awesome, right? Again, it's easy to forget because of the last decade how magical Facebook at its best really felt when you were like, oh, this is someone I haven't talked to in a little while. And I got exactly the right notification about their kid or their dog or their graduation. And it really was pretty wonderful. But then what started going into newsfeed, which made a lot of sense, it's called newsfeed after all, was more actually news content and more content unrelated to what your friends were doing. And that's where the hijacking of this attention signal, you could see it start. And we started seeing the first, I had left Facebook by the 2016 election, and particularly the late teens in COVID was when we really started seeing good research and reporting on outrage and the fact that the best way to generate attention, best way to generate engagement is to engage with outrageous and polarizing content. And we have all seen and we all know whether people are doing advertising, whether they're trying to build a personal brand, whether they're trying to increase reach. Remember BuzzFeed emerged at this time,
Yep.
right? It was those first headlines of "You won't believe what happened next." And
Upworthy, all those
yeah,
types of ones.
all of that, right? And particularly in the United States where we are so polarized, for news content, highly polarized content and highly outrageous polarized content was a shortcut to generating engagement. And that makes news a really challenging type of content to deliver in ranked feeds. That early experience at Facebook was pretty foundational to understanding that.
So let's then take this to NewsArc. First, can you
Mhm.
explain what NewsArc and Smart News is?
Totally. So Smart News is a news aggregator. Smart News has been going for a long time. It got founded in Japan in 2013 and was first just a news aggregator in Japan and really, really successful. And a few years ago, Smart News came to the US. And so there is a Smart News US news aggregator as well. I joined 2 years ago. And when I joined, the goal was, could we do better in a highly polarized news market like the United States? And as we spent the last 2 years exploring that, what we realized is there was an opportunity to build a different way to rank and prioritize the news and to do something that wasn't attention reinforcement ranked and to actually take advantage of all this incredible AI technology that came out. And NewsArc is the expression of that idea. We just launched it. We are in the first baby steps of NewsArc right now. It's free to use. It's on iOS and Android. And if you download it and use it, what you will see is it feels really different for really two primary reasons. The first one is it's not personalized. Instead, it says if you are in the US, there are some news stories today that matter to you. And part of experiencing news is actually shared context. And so we have what's called the daily dozen. And it can change a little bit during the day because sometimes news happens during the day, but it's pretty stable. And it is the biggest, most important news events happening in the US. And the other thing you will notice about that is it isn't an infinite stream of stories about those news events, because the next thing we do is for those news events, we rank by quality and we focus on what is the quality of the actual articles written about this news event. And we have hundreds and hundreds of news partners. We have great relationships. We actually pay for content. I think this is really important. And it gives us the opportunity to figure out for a given news event, what's the best article to read? Because there are tons of journalists out there whose job it is to write the best to read, most informative, most amazing coverage of something that's happening. And so what we're trying to do is surface the best one for you. And if it turns out, there are 2 or 3 articles that you need to read to really understand the complete story, what we'll do is we'll point you to all 3 of them. But we'll say, start with this one, and then maybe you need to read these other 2. And then if you want to go beyond just those top news stories, we talk about it as explicit choice. Tell us what you want to follow. You can follow topics, you can follow publications, and we'll do all of our same quality ranking magic, but then through the lens of what you said you wanted to follow. And that basically makes like a personalized magazine for you that you can touch base in, and we call it a collection. You can just go dive in to that. But in both cases, it's very much you telling us what you think is important and us signaling back to you what we think is the most important news happening right now, and try to be really efficient for you in exploring it.
What's the mix of humans versus computers in making some of those decisions of the daily dozen, of the quality of all of that? Because that is one of the hardest balances of all to kind of figure out. And I get frustrated sometimes because everyone's like, just put a human in the loop. And I'm like, sometimes the robots are better at things and you need a mix of them. So how do you all think about that?
So it's such a good question. And you've been, you're especially from your Facebook time, you were at sort of the first wave of these discussions. So you've been in these mixes. So the vast majority of it is machines. We ingest tens of thousands of articles a day. And we do a ton of processing on that to understand what's going on in it. Again, many, many, many different quality signals. Because when I talk about quality, I'm not just talking about hard news. I'm talking about any kind of news. I always think about like celebrity gossip, right? Celebrity gossip can be super compelling, and there are really good versions of it and there are really bad versions of it. And our hypothesis is that there is an ability to detect that quality difference along a large number of different axes. And so we use large language models. We use very modern AI techniques to generate those signals. Now, we're not training models. We're not fine tuning models. We're not building models, because I think particularly for creatives, it's actually pretty important not to be training models with your creative output, because, well, 2 things. One, your creativity is then forever in that model and you can't take it out again. And so you've kind of trained a model to imitate you, which I think if that's your profession, you probably don't want to be doing. And of course, also your content is extractable from the model as well. And so we don't think either of those make a lot of sense for journalists and news publications. So we don't train or build models. We're just using them basically as more advanced versions of what used to be called natural language processing
Hmm.
to generate these signals. And we have humans in the loop at the very end stage of, let's do a quick check every now and then on where the daily dozen is and make sure nothing went off the rails. But we originally had, an affirmative step in the process, and we took that out, boy, almost 6 months ago now, because it was so rare that the humans in the loop were like, I need to do something about this. Instead, what we do is we take that same expertise and say, go write prompts, right? Take the process you would have used to think about how you would analyze an article or a news event or stories about it, and go play with prompts and go write them. Because one of the truly spectacular changes of being in this world of large language models and generative AI is that you can take the expertise of non-programmers and apply it and surface it. And in fact, what you often find is that non-programmers sometimes write much better prompts because they're not thinking like a programmer. They're just thinking like, well, how would I tell a human about this?
Yeah.
And for a lot of the models, and obviously the prompts are different. Like Gemini actually likes really long rambling prompts. Like it just wants a ton of detail. OpenAI kind of likes sharper prompts and has, things like that. So there are differences between the different models, but a lot of times let somebody go play. And what'll come out of it, suddenly you have, because we have a bunch of tooling to allow these data pipelines to be experimented with and new ones to be created. And when a non-programmer is able to go experiment with them, they suddenly come up and like, look what I just built and it's awesome. And so that's a big part of where we make sure we are taking the very best expertise we can find, and making sure we are deploying that expertise basically at scale for all of our users to get to experience.
How do you all think about political bias as well? I know this is a super, maybe the trickiest question in the world right now, but one that is incredibly on top of mind. And I have to imagine, you should tell me, but like, I think I like that you give times being like, hey, there might be multiple sources you should read on this to kind of understand that. But how are you all trying to think about that and approach that?
And so it's something we think about all the time. Like I don't think you can work anywhere near news in the United States and not be almost overwhelmed by this question. Really, as we dug into it, we got to a couple of, I think, maybe somewhat counterintuitive positions on it. The first one is, one, clearly people are being overwhelmed by it because a political and polarized content is the shortcut to generating attention. And so if you are trying to get found in conventional feeds, or if you're trying to monetize content in a conventional feed, being as outrageous as possible is rewarded in all directions. Now, it turns out in the long run, it isn't rewarded. There are a lot of good data and studies out. Nature did a meta study on this. That it turns out the way to drive people off of platforms is to keep slamming them with polarized content,
Yeah.
even though in the short term they will over engage. In the long run, you get news avoidance, and it's why we're at 43% of Americans say they regularly avoid the news, and so obviously this is real. So the first thing we do is we actually go looking for whether the content is intentionally polarizing. And if it is, we score it very low, because what we have found is that news organizations, now it's split because a lot of companies have a news organization and an opinion organization. And in opinion, we're actually much more tolerant of polarized content. Although we still downscore content that we judge to be just trying to generate outrage. But we found is in the news organizations, we see very little of that content. So that was the first sort of discovery that made us go, wait, what? Because I think everybody comes to news with, well, the first thing I need to think about is I need to talk about left, right on everything. And I have to talk about the left, right bias of the source on everything. And instead, what we found is if you're actually looking at journalism, for the most part, the reporting on stories tends to include the same claims. People would talk about it as facts. I'm going to call it claims because at the point of reporting, it's a claim. And what you find is the claims are very, very aligned, even between sources that you would traditionally think of as being very politicized. And again, it's actually not super surprising when you go talk to journalists about this, because journalists are like, no, my job is to actually go in and report. And we have journalistic standards and we have an editorial board, et cetera, et cetera. Now, where you see the political slant from different sources or different companies will be at the stack rank on their homepage, right? You'll see stories at very different places on the homepage, but that doesn't matter to us because we're doing our own ranking anyway. And
Yeah.
so I don't care if they delivered something that on their page, on their homepage is 3 pages down. If we think it's an amazing article, we'll still surface it in the top of the Daily Dozen. And so instead, what we have discovered and what we use LLMs to go dig into is there sometimes are splits on story, but assuming that it is a political split is sort of the least interesting way to think about it. And instead, just go in for, why are there different clusters of claims? Why are there differences in the claims? Is it because that was early reporting versus late reporting? Because you can actually watch as a news story happens, there's sort of this wave of coverage If it was overnight, it starts at 6 a.m. on the East Coast and it sort of moves outward.
Yep.
And then about 24 hours later, there's the syndicated version. So there's this second wave of the same coverage that comes out. And what's great is there's no reason to keep showing a reader identical content. Right? If you already read this and you already know it, I don't need to show it to you again. And so we can be really smart about that. But sometimes there really is a difference in coverage. And so let's go surface that. And then let's dig into, well, what is driving the difference? Is this just a political difference of opinions? Because after all, I think there are some very legitimate baseline biases between how you would talk about something from a liberal or conservative position. But more often it's like, is this an urban rural split? Is this an East Coast left coast split? Is this a US international split? And as a reader who's being asked or being told by NewsArc, hey, you might want to read two articles about this. I think it's on us to tell you, like, why should you read the second article? Like, is it giving you a different perspective, and what about that perspective might be worth reading? And so again, none of this is to pretend that political bias doesn't exist. It clearly exists. But again, if you Reuters has some really, really high quality annual surveys on news. And one of the things you see in that, and YouGov has done surveying on this as well,
Hmm.
people who want to follow the news in the US, they tend to cross shop already. Like they have a New York Times subscription, but they go to Fox News sometimes, or they're on Fox News, but they will also read the Washington Post. And so they're already cross shopping because the reality is people who are interested in the news are trying to get like the whole picture, right? That's what they're trying to get. And I think the last one is, and again, this goes into when you really dig into the coverage, you dig into the stories, it can be really misleading to think that even an editorial board at a newspaper has a singular political position.
Yeah.
It's much more likely that they have differences for financial coverage versus political coverage versus crime coverage versus sports coverage versus, movies and entertainment coverage. And they might have biases in each of these. And so why would we start from, oh, this organization is left or right? Instead, we can, for each of these stories, be navigating it. And if everybody covered the story in the same way, there is no bias. There's provably not bias in the reporting there. So let's just report the story.
So I want to go into you talked about news avoidance in that answer there, which is obviously hitting record highs. And to your point, those that are interested in the news are already probably getting a cross section. There's a lot of people who are just avoiding it altogether because they're just overwhelmed. There's too much. We've heard so much of this, but from your all's research and your observations and stuff, what do you think is one of the more overlooked drivers of this news avoidance trend?
Well, so it's not overlooked, but let's start from the one that has been measured and studied quite a bit, which is simply if you keep throwing deeply polarized, outrageous content at people, they will stop coming back. And I think we've seen the results of this in terms of like there's so much less news in newsfeed today than when we were
Mhm.
there, despite Facebook a couple times or Meta a couple times trying to bring more news into newsfeed. And they are really, really smart folks. And if they're deprioritizing it, it's because in the long run, they're making a decision about, the quality and engagement overall with feed one would expect. I don't know that as a fact, but like again, they're really smart. And this is what the Nature study found, and it was a study of studies as well. So, and it's not surprising, right? Like none of us just want to be abused with the kind of content that is so polarized and so outrageous. Like that isn't an experience that any of us want to add on top of, our news engagement. And I think I think that's one. Another one is when we go back to, not to fully date myself, but like if you go back to newspapers, there's a reason newspapers have sections because you start on the front page, but you're like, I got through A3. I think I'm going to go look at sports for a while, or I'm going to go look at lifestyle for a while. And then I'm going to pick up on and you had this ability to sort of path your way through your media experience, your news experience. And this isn't surprising. Like if you look at how people engage with news, and again, I can only speak to the ones I have seen, people come back multiple times a day and they come back with different intention, right? There's that first touch point of the day of, well, what happened overnight? Maybe there's a story you've been tracking. Did anything change with it? What do I need to know about today? If I go into the office, am I going to be surprised because everybody's talking about something? And a lot of times that's a skim the headlines, maybe skim the first paragraph and sort of make note of like, is there anything you want to go deeper on? Then later in that day, maybe it's a coffee break or at lunchtime. Oh, actually, I'm kind of interested in this topic. Is there a longer story to go read about it? Did The Atlantic do a 10,000 word piece on this last week that I missed that is worth, diving into? And so there's that deeper dive. And then, in the evening, a lot of times you'll also see, because end of the day is sports scores now are done. How did your team do? Was it a 40-point frickin' tie for crying out loud?
Oh my God, we're going to do a whole other podcast about how we should not have ties in the NFL. Sorry.
And like that's end of the day kind of stuff, right? Which in theory is relaxing unless it was a 40-point tie. And so you have these different ways to engage. And if your news is coming to you from an attention ranked feed, you don't have any choice about that. All you are getting is slammed into you. This is the thing that maybe you will click on right now. And it's like we're putting the blink tag from early aughts web design back in. And so it's another of the pieces that's very, very different if you explore NewsArc, because we're not doing that style and because we give you a space in the product for your own collections and your own ability to build things where you're like, these are the kinds of things I like to go deep on. And we're giving you something that it's not a newspaper. Let's not pretend that it is, but it's giving you more ability to kind of choose, like, why am I coming back to NewsArc right now? What are my goals? What are my expectations? And how do I go have the experience that fits what I have time to do right now?
Well, and it's the intentionality about it, right? Like you see a lot of these studies, and there was a study that Google did a couple years ago that I've just been obsessed with about the 7 information modes people are in. And I'll be in conferences or a conversation. People are like, Gen Z doesn't listen to the news, or these people don't want the news. And I'm like, no, they do. They just want to be intentional when they go and get it, which is why I think podcasts, newsletters, and other things where you're going into it with the news consumption mode in your brain and you get that choice versus I'm logging on to TikTok or Instagram or something with a feed where I maybe just want to see cats with Roombas or, the more lighthearted content. I
Right.
don't wanna be fed that thing that I don't have as much choice over of what is being seen there. And so I've got one last question for you because I could talk to you for so much more time, but let's look forward to 2030, which feels bajillion years away, but also a blink of an eye away from here. What's one change you hope that Smart News and NewsArc helps drive and a risk that you're worried the industry hasn't quite grappled with yet?
Oh, I think that by 2030, my hope is, and what we are building toward really strongly, is that people are able to return to getting news in ways that actually respects them and actually respects journalists, respects the readers of news, respects their time and attention, and isn't just something that exists as part of a must keep clicking feed. And of course, I think all of our worries in the news ecosystem is that if news continues to just chase clicks, how are you going to have a healthy news ecosystem in that world? We are building the future that we hope will improve things, and we're going to go keep iterating and learning as we go. Come check it out. Come give us feedback and help us build it.
Yeah, how can they download it? They can find it in any app store right now?
Yep, any app store, or go to newsarc.com, and it has links to iOS or the Apple App Store and the Google Play Store.
Fantastic. Corey, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this.
Katie, thank you so much. This was a blast.
Thanks for listening for our co- with our con- Thanks for listening to our conversation with Corey. My favorite takeaway of this conversation was really talking about the role of editors and how it's not going away, but how is the job evolving? And I think that that's a way I'm trying to approach all of this. We see so many headlines about how AI is going to take away so many jobs, but we're not talking enough about how those jobs are going to evolve. And I think that that is a really important conversation we need to have. If you're interested in this, I also recently wrote a piece about how our feeds are changing and the way that it's going to impact your marketing strategy. So make sure you check that out on my Substack at acrechange.substack.com. But until then, I'll see you next time.